Continuar con la tarde de hoy.
To continue with today's afternoon program, we'll continue a very interesting point here, which is asset forfeiture law, and to see some examples in some countries, and to understand how Panama is doing in regards to asset forfeiture. I would like to invite Jonathan Reed, which is the Secretary of Public Ministry of Panama, on behalf of the Minister, in representation of the Minister. I would like to also invite Mr. Germán Garavano from Argentina, former Minister of Justice and Human Rights of Argentina, and one of the main promoters of the law for asset forfeiture in the Republic of Argentina. Welcome, Jonathan. Also online, we have Luis Petri, Deputy of the Nation of Argentina. He will also be with us virtually. He is a congressman of Argentina for the province of Mendoza, and Mr. Armando Padilla, which is a justice advisor at the U.S. Embassy and a colleague and a strategic partner in the law for asset forfeiture. So, Armando, if you would like to sit over here. I think there's more than a meter and a half. When we talk about asset forfeiture, this is key for all countries, not only Panama. Being able to remove assets, resources, money, bank accounts, and properties from organized crime, it's fundamental to fight the structure of organized crime. It does not help for the police and our law enforcement agencies in Latin America to arrest people and different members of criminal organizations, because if you arrest one, there are other 10 waiting to fill in the shoes of that one that was arrested. So the economic resources of the structure is intact, then we would never be able to debilitate the framework. In a process in the last few years supporting El Salvador in the law of asset forfeiture, we were helping out that country when they wanted to reform the law. And along with that experience, we started to support the government of Panama, mainly the Ministry of Public Security. They now have a draft law presented at the National Assembly. They will present this in detail and to understand the experience of other countries. We now have Deputy Petri from Argentina. Welcome, Mr. Deputy. And we're waiting to have Mr. Garavano in the screen also. So I'm here as a moderator, as part of the panel. So allow myself to intervene. So, dear S. Jonathan, can you tell us where Panama is and why you're working on this asset forfeiture law? Can you explain the process? Yes, Alejo, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of the Minister of Security. He is unable to attend due to other commitments in his agenda, but I am here in his representation to thank the auditorium for being in this very important forum in regards to intelligence and security. I would like to start with two questions, Alejo. How are we able to minimize the capacity of criminal organizations to recruit? And how can we stop the level of expansion that they've shown in the last few years? So we have initiatives as asset forfeiture law that would like to weaken their financial capacity, to remove their financial muscle, which is what they use to finance their illegal activities. In that sense, the national government, through a technical committee, created a legal framework that would like to include in our justice system asset forfeiture law. This law gathers the best practices implemented throughout the region by countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Argentina, where each of them, and also Colombia, it's important to highlight Colombia, Each of them have had experiences prior to ours, and they've been able to generate very important and dismantlement of different criminal organizations through their asset forfeiture law. This working table members of the judicial branch of the Ministry of Economy and Finance, which for a period of about a year and a half, we were debating as to what should be the model law that the country needed for this, taking into consideration that the best practices have indicated that we need a solid legal framework that is sustainable, that would allow those that need to ensure that the law is complied with to be able to assess property with illegal ownership, that meaning through these assets they are able to finance their criminal activities, and by removing this then we can curb their recruitment, and they generate a lot of damage here. So the draft law, it's for organized crime organizations, right? The project is here to curb criminal activity, to take the resources with which they finance and recruit new members for organized crime. Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Luis Petri. He is a really good Argentinian. We have an international audience here, Mr. Deputy. So I think we should explain what's happening on your side of the screen. So before I explain that I'm drinking mate tea, which is a traditional infusion for Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, I would like to thank my friend Robert Pittinger for allowing me to be here in this panel and for all the support that they always provide to be able to move forward in legislation that is able to fight transnational crime. Knowing and understanding the power of articulation and cooperation among countries to be able to fight the scourge. This would not be possible without this push that we always have from Robert Pittinger to ensure that we always have this type of meetings where we're able not only to articulate but to ensure that legislation is able to standardize in points as important as seizing assets in many countries in the region. Mr. Deputy, what is the situation of Argentina and what's the experience that you could share in regards to the asset forfeiture? Beyond the law and the legal instrument they use in Argentina, the concept of asset forfeiture, and since we have parliamentary parliamentary members of the entire world, so maybe you could talk about that. We have a criminal code which would be 100 years old, and we've had many reforms. And it has used a figure that you understand where we're able to confiscate assets, which was mainly to the elements of the crime or the perpetrators of the specific crime, but it was not focused on those gains from a crime. The figure was expanded later because it was not enough to be able to prosecute the perpetrators, but rather due to the proliferation of criminal organizations to be able to move forward in the organized business of crime. The criminal process many times was an obstacle, and in many international conventions, and I like to mention the Rome Convention against Organized Crime and the Convention of Fight Against Corruption. Many different standards that we saw at an international level that requested from the states that it should not only sentence or wait for a sentence to be able to confiscate assets in the criminal arena. This was very important change, not for the legislation, not only of Latin America, for the whole world. Without having a criminal conviction, we were able to confiscate properties when it was either due to prescription, death, or because the person escaped, or any legal mechanism that would not allow us to move forward in the prosecution in certain processes. Without a doubt, the investigation of the assets would still under the criminal scope, meaning that we could still use the guiding principles of criminal law. So it was impossible to work in a retroactive manner, which was a limitation. The second point is that in the criminal process, and there is none, at least in the Republic of Argentina, there is no serious investigations of patrimony. So we have a criminal process where we need to typify and clearly state the perpetrator the crime, but the process does not really look at the assets and property which are gains of the crime. So now we move to confiscation, which no longer was an accessory, an auxiliary uh, part of the sentence. It became a sentence on its own. In 1989, we have the drug trafficking law, and now we start to foresee this anticipated confiscation. Nevertheless, it would take a lot more time because we needed to move forward in the money laundering cases and in terrorist financing cases. We were able to achieve this in 2009, but within the criminal process. In 2016, under the government of Cambiamos, Together for the Change, at that moment I was president of the Commission of Security of the Interior of the nation, and former Minister of Justice, Germán Garavano, and Patricia Woodruff, which was the Minister of Security, we were able to promote in Argentina the action of asset forfeiture, taking as an example the experience of Colombia, which we thought it was very interesting. They were not only able to approve the law in 1990s, but they've removed the constitutional barriers with a constitutional reform where it's no longer criminal but now it's civil. We're not going against a person but against a crime in itself, which can be applied in a retroactive manner and that can no longer prescribe because there is no way to be able to clean up everything that illicit crime has caused or harm. So our countries can no longer guarantee private property of criminal organizations, and this property needs to be removed and it needs to go back into the resources of the state. So this is why it's important for it to be autonomous with specialized prosecutors that are trained in this with a civil procedure that would be independent of all the principles of the criminal process. For example, the principle of you are not guilty until you're sentenced. In Colombia, the burden of the proof is switched where they're in the condition of proving that they're not guilty. And the person that has acquired the property through a legal way, then they need to be able to prove it. And if not, then it needs to go back to the state. So there are many points that are part of the process in regards to asset management. Colombia, which has been able to obtain for over $1 billion when they started with this asset forfeiture law, and we were informed to the United Nations in their report everything in regards to asset management which had an environmental and ecological impact. Specifically when we talk of the hippopotamus of Pablo Escobar that multiplied and generated a harm to the ecosystem. I think there are many different points that we need to think about, but the world and the region needs to be able to work on creating asset forfeiture law that could de-finance criminal organizations. Mr. Deputy, if you could, I could ask you, what is the process of asset management and what concrete examples do we have in Argentina in regards to assets that have been seized through asset forfeiture? And now I'd like to introduce our colleague Armando Padilla from the Department of Justice of the United States to explain the experience of the United States in regards to confiscation and how the United States, through the embassies, are able to support the different countries in regards to cooperation. As it was mentioned this afternoon, so organized crime is able to enjoy illegal resources or illegal wealth. And according to the report of the United Nations, 1% of these assets are seized. 99% are still in their ownership, and this wealth is used to finance violence and other types of crime and even corruption of authorities. Crime has no boundaries. And we need to keep in mind that, especially this phenomenon, it's something that trickles down into the economies. In what sense? Because it produces artificial economies and it promotes different monopolies. So, which does not allow legal investments uh, to come because it's not reasonable because their essence it's of these illegal organizations is to do money laundering. So as has already been mentioned, different international conventions and different efforts of the international community have been able to enact and advance in different tools that allow to be able to confiscate assets. In Europe, they have certain mechanisms. In Latin America, and just like in the United States. So I would like to focus on what's happening in Latin America. There is a model law which has been approved in some sessions by this organism, and it's allowed different states to uptake asset forfeiture laws, which is a criminal prosecution focused on the patrimony to be able to debilitate the power of criminal organizations. These model laws and the shared efforts of countries like Colombia, Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Peru, most recently, and Ecuador. They're all show that the of property would be returned to the state if they were not obtained through legal means through a process as our our speaker from Argentina explained. Within these models in the region, the public ministry is who would do the investigation of the patrimony with assistance of financial investigation and other judicial branches. They request a judge to adapt precautionary measures, whether it's to localize and fine assets, which are the proceeds or of crime. So after a period of investigation, the prosecutors request for specialized judges that specialize in asset forfeiture to ensure that they can move forth with the application of the law. There are several variables. If we can talk about the case of Panama, it would be to carry out this activity, firstly, to ensure that it's within the specific jurisdiction, meaning that only a judge can carry it out, not administrative authorities, and in an oral trial, an oral process, meaning that the prosecutor should show the reason for the asset forfeiture, meaning that he needs to be able to prove that these assets are proceeds of a crime, that they come from the transformation or conversion of other assets, that even though they were legally obtained, they were used to conceal the illegal activities. If we're able to see that there was illicit enrichment, that legal and illegal properties are used together. In this scenario, we protect, as we've said, the good faith of third parties. In what sense do I mean that? Because asset forfeiture protects the right to property in Panama. The Constitution states that private property it's protected if it was acquired by legal means, meaning that any assets of an individual outside of a legal scope, because if it's the proceeds through an illegal activity, then it can be under this law. If we talk about acquired rights, and that cannot be altered through the law, but specifically those assets that are part of the patrimony of a person, whether a corporation or individual, without complying with the specific standards, cannot call upon the constitutional protection. In this region, in the specific proposal of Panama, we would like to consolidate an administration organism that can conserve the value of the assets to ensure that their worth is not lost. And also for companies, we can ensure if they are seized to ensure that people do not lose their jobs and the company does not lose their worth, so that this administration organism is able to be able to then sell the assets and to have a level of economic gain that which then can be used for education and strengthening security. So meaning that the way in which asset forfeiture would work, it's in it will work through the elements that I explained. So in regards to good practices, in the Parlatino has a model law for asset forfeiture, and we always say that the asset forfeiture law plus the cybersecurity law that was approved this year, quite recently in February, plus the law to fight illegal trade and transnational organized crime, and model law approved in February of this year. These are three instruments that should work together as model laws to be able to inspire the legislations of other countries, whether it's in their reform or for the policymakers in the countries that do not have these laws. But we should also think about them as independent instruments. In Parlatino, we have this experience and the capacity of being able to share this with all the countries, not only of Latin America and the Caribbean, but worldwide, because there are legislations worldwide that can always be improved. Another example is the example of Honduras. We will talk about what happens with these funds. Honduras has a really good experience in regards to specific assets that came from drug trafficking, and through the asset forfeiture law, it came back to the state, and they were able to transform this into a home for children and adolescents that were in very vulnerable situations. The most important thing is that asset forfeiture as a tool that can assist public authorities to work against organized crime, specifically against cartels, allowed for a specific drug trafficker where his assets were seized from his protection circle when finally he no longer had his protection circle, which was based in money, based in finance and properties that they had. Finally, this individual did not have this circle of protection, and we were able to move forward. And this is a really good example of how the law resources can be used. In that sense, going back to what would happen to the assets, which is a question of the citizens who would administrate or manage these assets, where would the assets end up? So, two simultaneous questions. First, Panama, and secondly, for Argentina. So, what would you do with the assets? What does the law indicate that you would do with the assets in Panama? And Deputy Petri, the question for you is an example from Argentina of assets that were seized through the asset forfeiture law. Those resources came into the states and a specific benefit that they've had. Panama first, please.
En el caso
Yes, in Panama's case, the law has established an office specifically for assets seized through this law, and it seeks to minimize the development of criminal activities. It also seeks to, in any way possible, return or repay those who have suffered, restitute those who have suffered because of these crimes. There is also a very effective administration of the goods in terms of advance sales, the possibility that the authority in the Ministry of Economy and Finance might be able to use those resources quickly. Actually, what's happening now is that many times goods are lost because it is a slow process. So what you're saying is that with the Panamanian project, those goods are used to support programs, government programs. It is a public order and social interest law. So the goal is to meet the needs of the population, especially considering the fact that these goods are collected to support the government and to avoid the continuation of these kinds of crimes. I would like to comment something here as well, because asset forfeiture returns that social concept to these goods. It returns the goods to the society. And so it is really important that that is our goal. These are products, goods that had an illicit source, or they were legal products, but they were used by organized crime. A home, for example, a vehicle. It could be anything. These are goods that are returned to society so that they can be used properly and legally. So, Mr. Petri, what are the beneficial experiences that you've had in Argentina? I'm not sure if Germán Garavano is there. He was going to talk about the law that we have in Argentina, but if he's not here, I can explain it. It is true that in the Republic of Argentina, I was the informant for the committee, and there were certainly some goods that have that characteristic, as you were mentioning. This project that we were working on spent quite a lot of time in the legislative branch. It was modified and came in completely different to the legislative branch. There were no autonomous processes. There were a lot of different problems that we were seeing and concerns about how the asset forfeiture could happen. So at that point, the president of the country at that time presented a decree, which is one of the abilities that the president has to create legislative decrees, that in the case that this would not be approved by both legislative bodies, then it would continue to be valid. That decree was not enforced, and some provinces, among them I will specifically mention my province, Mendoza, made modifications to their processing legislation, and so this legislation, which is not being applied, was being used only for crimes against public administration, that is to say, specifically corruption. So there were kind of two processes. One has been completed. The other one involved forfeiture, and the forfeiture has been completed for a public officer who was condemned or was found guilty of corruption, and his goods were returned to the state. 3 vehicles, luxury vehicles, and 3 properties. So this asset forfeiture law establishes specific goods and cash, whatever other kind of financial instrument it may be, and it ensures their return to the government. The judge has to authorize this process so that quickly the goods can be sold, which avoids damages where those goods cannot be properly maintained in their original state. Thank you very much for that. Coming back to the region and to Panama. Panama is a logistics hub in terms of international commerce and with many countries, not just in Latin America, but in nearly every continent. What is the expectation for dealing with this with other countries? There may be goods that, while they may belong to Panamanians or Panamanian companies, they may be in Panama, and during an investigation, you may discover that they belong to organized crime, but their goods are not in Panama. How do you intend to work on that? So the framework establishes international cooperation to an extent where investigations can be done in a joint manner with the authorities from those countries where we believe that there are goods that are the product of illegal activities. We are able to share the information and to develop those investigations properly. There must be a due process. The Panamanian law respects the right to property, as you mentioned at the beginning. And our framework establishes guarantees. So there is a right to a defense. There's a right to a judge, which is called a rights judge, and there are other rights that are protected. What about the good faith third party? This is something that worries a lot of people. Yes, the good faith third party has a special protection in the asset forfeiture law. And there are recommendations and international standards. There's a model law from the UN for us, and it gives an example. It provides protections for those who have received these assets in good faith. It does require a certain level of due diligence on behalf of anyone who acquires any good. That is to say, there is a possibility that is to say, there must be some care taken to avoid participating in these kinds of illegal activities. So, businesses and others must participate in this kind of cultural shift. When you acquire a good, it's important to be able to show that it was acquired in good faith. I know this client, I know my counterpart, and there was some exploration done to try to understand what the situation of this good was before. We know that organized crime uses different tools to hide their goods or to transform them or to kind of throw you off the trail of their illicit origin. Thank you very much. We do know of many cases in the countryside, in many Latin American countries, where those organizations come in through a local structure, and perhaps a young person who grew up in the same neighborhood their whole life asks an older woman, 70 or 80, if she could open a bank account for him. He's got some debt or whatever. He makes up a story. She opens up an account for him and allows him to deliver certain assets to her or in her name. And then she is under investigation. But it's someone that she knows, someone who she knew from her neighborhood. Of course, she trusts him. So this requires that we do a little bit more research to understand what's behind it. And this is also why it's important to have awareness raising and education of our population so that they can understand this during the asset forfeiture process. What would you say from Argentina in this issue of goodwill third parties? Well, certainly we have to pursue the goods even when there have been simulated transfers or other kinds of transfers. In that case, the goods will still need to be returned to the state. Now, in the case of good faith third parties, our decree does determine that the action of asset forfeiture is not valid for goodwill third parties. So when we find ourselves facing a goodwill third party and there needs to be a sentence of asset forfeiture, then the amount of the goods that were transferred to the third party cannot be included in that asset forfeiture action. It must be substituted for the cash amount that was represented by those goods. And then we can do the action of asset forfeiture. Yesterday and today we were talking quite a bit about cryptocurrency and crypto assets, digital assets, etc. The question always comes up with asset forfeiture law. We understand that these should be modern legislation, but what is the connection here between asset forfeiture and crypto assets? We understand that there is a way to forfeit assets or digital assets. Is there a way to do that, or is there not? And does the law need to include that? Does the law have jurisdiction? This is a question which is quite broad. Yes, as you mentioned, the new criminal activities really force those in law enforcement to reinvent ourselves. In the Panamanian security forces, we are constantly updating our staff and training our staff on cybercrime. A financial investigation came into the police force, and there was a financial investigation unit for cybercrime specifically, which shows how we are being resilient and adapting to new criminal methodologies. Organized crime does not stop, and crime does not stop. They are reinventing themselves every day. The security forces must do the same. Yes, we have to keep in mind that the experience of criminal investigation in the past, traditionally in our countries and in the region, was concerned primarily with forfeiting assets that were physical assets. A vehicle, some other property. And so the criminal process was limited. But when we're looking at asset forfeiture, we can see that the focus or the attention is directed at the entire patrimony, so to speak, or everything that this person has all of the profits from this illegal behavior. So asset forfeiture seeks to investigate profits, not necessarily the person, but the goods. Let me give you a really clear example. You have a vehicle, a public transport vehicle. Many times in criminal processes in the region, the vehicle itself might be seized, but not the license with which the vehicle was operated. And that may have, in some places, even more value than the vehicle itself. So the goal of asset forfeiture is to open up that spectrum. Of course, that will require investigative technology, specialized investigations, close collaboration with FIUs, and international assistance. Thank you, Armando. Luis, crypto assets and asset forfeiture. Where is crypto included in asset forfeiture? Okay, so first of all, I think the issue with crypto assets is individualizing them and finding them, of course. In general, when we talk about legislation on the continent, asset forfeiture actions happen in the preparatory or introductory phases of the criminal process. In the region, at least in Argentina, in most countries of the region, in a few countries, I don't want to say all of them, we haven't been able to really separate ourselves completely from the criminal process. And that is why everything related to titles, crypto, whatever other activity, it requires proof that can be presented quickly. In Argentina, we have a federal system, and when we're looking at crypto, it's very important at the very beginning of the investigation to have a full investigation of assets, complete assets. When we are looking at crime, organized crime, there is movements of enormous levels of property, whether it's cash, property, art, etc., etc. So the proof that is needed in order to seize and forfeit these goods is so important. Even beyond that, our legislation does not contain specific specifications, and so it would treat cryptocurrency just the same as it does cash. Thank you very much. Thanks to all three of you for participating, for sharing some information about this idea of forfeiture, hearing from Argentina, from Panama, which is going through a very interesting process in which the new assembly will have to deal with as the year moves forward. We hope that that will come out soon because Panama urgently needs this asset forfeiture law for goods of illegal goods that have been obtained illegally. And so we want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts here. I don't know if we have any key questions, any really relevant questions from the audience. Can we get a microphone? Representative from Costa Rica, right? Yes, sir. Representative here from Costa Rica. Hello, everyone. I'm a member of the directive board of Parlatino. Thank you very much for being here today to talk about this very important subject, which many of our legislative bodies have avoided talking about. In Costa Rica, there was a project presented, a bill in 2015, which started in the previous period. The representatives who were in position before me, and they did manage to develop a text through the legislative process. However, those who were adverse to this process have tried to file this away. I am perfectly aware of the need to advance and make progress with an asset forfeiture law. However, with the project currently in Costa Rica, there are 18 possible crimes that allow for asset forfeiture. Certainly, that is very open, like corruption and tax evasion. There is a concern that those goods may not be 100% related to one of those crimes, but rather just a small percent. So, listening to the experience from Argentina specifically, and those of you who spoke at the beginning of the discussion, would you consider that asset forfeiture should be focused primarily on drug trafficking and organized crime, or should it be open more broadly? How can we ensure that we're really making progress with the implementation of asset forfeiture throughout the region so that we can be more assertive in this issue? Especially looking at all sorts of crime, including organized crime, which then results in obtaining certain goods. What an excellent comment, Representative. I would say, first of all, there is no crime that legitimizes a good. In that sense, we would have to think about what sort of crime could mean that a good is constitutionally and judicially legitimate. We would have to ask ourselves, any kind of financial activity that generates illegal goods should be included in asset forfeiture. We can then take away that financial strength from these groups and promote the development of social activities and appropriate social activities. Limiting it to certain kinds of crime will produce negative results because there continue to be funds that are the product of a criminal activity. Thank you very much. Would you like to comment as well? Yes, really, in the region, when we deal with asset forfeiture in Colombia, for example, we created it with a certain closed group of crimes that were included. There was a list of crimes. However, we had an experience with a specific case, which I think was shared and heard about even here in Panama. There was an organization which did pyramid schemes, financial pyramid schemes. We have them here in Panama. You might have heard of them. And so there was a scam like that. In Colombia, those crimes are not included in the list of illegal activities that qualify for asset forfeiture. For that reason, there was a modification. And we moved from having that closed list of crimes to having language that said that illegal activities were subject to asset forfeiture, specifically because of that experience. And that experience is the reason that the model law for the region talks about illicit activities or illegal activities instead of reducing it to a certain catalog of activities. In the different prosecutors' offices, which have the ability to investigate these activities, each country has its own experience. For example, there are countries in Central America where we'll say, what are we going to do with these funds that transporters are bringing into the airport without declaring? So we decided to include that in asset forfeiture. In Mexico, for example, there are these workshops where they worked on cars. There's a whole mafia behind that. And each country has their own reality in terms of the illegal activities that they're doing. And that is why it is preferable to talk about illegal activities instead of having a specific catalog of crimes. I do want to emphasize the fact that asset forfeiture is a tool that should be directed and coordinated at criminal organizations, and we should not lower its use and use it for activities that are less serious, or to forfeit assets or seize assets that aren't significantly valuable. That's kind of the balance from one to another. Thank you, Armando. We will wrap up with our comments from Mr. Petri from Argentina. Yes, I absolutely agree about what's been said here. However, from the Republic of Argentina, my opinion, based on our context and the difficulties that we have had in dealing with this issue, I personally am convinced that we must move progressively in the implementation of this tool to start to remove some of the fears that exist about the improper use of asset forfeiture law to simply steal, essentially. And so there are concerns out there about crime linked to organized crime, specifically organized crime and not other common crimes. The bill and the law does establish the kinds of crimes that are included, and it does have to do with money laundering, terrorism financing, terrorist acts, trafficking in drugs, in people, in weapons, and customs and contraband crimes. I do believe that we need to continue evolving the law progressively and amplifying it progressively to see what kind of others will be included. Colombia, for example, has threatened unions that close the streets or block the streets, and they have threatened to use asset forfeiture law against them with the fact that they are committing a crime by blocking the streets. I believe that this develops a significant level of distrust about the implementation of this tool in our region. And so we must overcome this square of impunity. That is the lack of trust that there is because of the judiciary operatives when they apply this tool. Disinterest and a lack of information that exists about asset forfeiture. So I think we have to break down those myths. We have to focus on crimes that have a high economic impact and crimes that are have a high impact on our community. Thank you very much. With that, I would like to thank our panelists, and I would like a round of applause for them. And with that, we will close this panel for asset forfeiture at our forum today. Before we go